Welcome, everyone. Welcome to today's sessions. Just to let you know that the meeting is being recorded, so if you would prefer, you can keep your camera off. You could also use the chat if you want to leave any comments. For those of you who weren't here last week when we had the webinar, I'm Shan Pisani, and I'm the project officer for the CEUT project. The project has researchers working together with the community to see how Gaelic activities and digital technologies can help conserve heritage and increase community well-being. One of the project outputs was a survey of the North Uist community. And this is what brings us to these webinars. Last week, we had a webinar talking about recording Gaelic place names, which was one of the issues that the community outlined. And today we're discussing another issue, climate change and preserving heritage that can be lost due to climate change. We have another wonderful panel today. We have Jan Robertson, who's the local council member chairing the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee. He's also the chair of CEUT, which is the North Uist Historical Society. We have John Love, who's a naturalist who's published several books about sea animals, and he's also a guide of the Outer Hebrides. He's unfortunately not able to hear us at the moment, but we're hoping to sort out the technical difficulties. Then we have Maria Andre, who's a first-year PhD researcher at the University of St. Andrews, investigating how virtual reality can help communicate the effects of climate change on vulnerable areas like North Uist. We have Jess Wood, who's a health researcher supporting CEUT. She's in fact part of the CEUT project. And we have Kay Hall, all the way from Barbados, who's the Education and Community Outreach Officer at Barbados Museum and Heritage Society. So I'll start with Jan again today. Jan, could you tell us a few words about your work and North Uist?
Thank you. You're always picking on me first. I don't know why, but anyway, I hope John is hearing us now. I'm seeing him anyway, so I usually come across it at airports. That's where we met over the last while. But I've been doing something today, which probably it's a traditional something we do here is cutting peats, of course. So there's been a lot of rumour about because of the impact of peat. That might be stopped at some point, but I still do it in the traditional style with the peat iron treishke, as they say in Gaelic. And I was thinking back to a conversation last time when we had a gentleman from as far away as Turkey talking, and he mentioned coming across all kinds of things when they're doing some research on some of the rural areas in Turkey. And it reminded me, when we cut peats, when you go down a certain level, you come across all the time bits of tree trunk, which shows that at some point we were covered in trees. And one of the hills in my own township here in Carnes is called Binnacullig, which is Hill of the Wood. There's no sign of any trees on it at the moment, but there must have been at some time, which shows the climate must have been markedly different in North Uist a few thousand years ago. But currently, in terms of the concerns in relation to climate change here, has been in relation to coastal erosion, particularly, and the council have their own climate change strategy 22-27, where in that they say sea level rises of 1 meter under a high emission scenario by 2100 is possible. And in terms of what concerns the community here, I suppose it's the issue of causeways between islands here, because one of our main causeways, Ballisher Causeway, overtops significantly every winter now with the rise of the sea level rises. And for us as a council to work on that causeway and raise it costs about £9 million, which is money we don't have. So in terms of infrastructure, there is concerns here about coastal erosion, impact on roads to certain communities, causeways particularly. There's also the issues, of course, of crofting housing here, you know, hard to heat housing, and we've seen the kind of commentary from Patrick Harvey yesterday and today in what the Scottish Government intend to do. So there'll be a few arguments about that going forward, but I'll leave it at that just now, Sharon.
Yes, thank you very much. I'll see if John Love's audio is working now. He's joining us through Teams, possibly. John, can you hear us? We see two of you, but unfortunately cannot hear any of you. I think we'll get back to John in a few minutes. I'll go to Maria now, who's working on communicating climate change. Can you tell us a bit more about that, Maria?
Hi, thank you, Sharon. Yes, I'm trying to use VR in order to create more effective climate communication on vulnerable areas such as North Uist. And as has been just mentioned, sea level rise and coastal erosion are one of the biggest vulnerabilities that the island is experiencing. And that is because of a few reasons. Firstly, because of more often occurring storms that are more and more extreme, that are inundating the roads, as it's also been pointed out. So I'm trying to build simulations in VR that showcase these extreme events. And the one that I'm working on right now is a scene of a storm and how it will end up blocking the roads. And in my research, I'm also trying to show the connection between the locality, Scotland, and the impacts that we're experiencing here and how they're connected with remote impacts of climate change, such as the melting of the ice sheets, for example, in Antarctica, or the melting of sea ice in the North Pole, because that's what eventually is what's leading to the sea level rise in Scotland. So yeah, thank you very much for having me, and I'm excited for the discussion with everyone.
Thank you, Maria. I think it's very interesting to really visualize climate change because, as you said, there's a lot of extreme weather. For instance, here it's pouring rain, but back home in Malta, it's sweltering hot. And I think unless people see how it's affecting other places, maybe they might not even realize that climate change is happening all around us. I'll go to Jess next. So tell us a bit about your work with Öresund and how climate change and heritage also affect health and well-being.
Thanks, Sharon, and thanks so much for inviting me to tonight's session. I'll just got some slides that I'm going to share, and hopefully I'll get this to work. Is that coming up for you?
No.
Right, thank you. And is that coming up now?
No.
No? Wait. Okay, now it's coming up.
Now it's coming up. Perfect. Okay, sorry about that. So yes, I'm Jess Wood, and I am I'm from the University of Aberdeen. I work with Sharon, along with the North Historical Society, the rest of the members of the Virtual Worlds University of St Andrews, and members of the team from University Highlands and Islands on the Air Sun project. So my background is healthcare research, but it's predominantly in healthcare settings. So the Air Sun project's actually my first experience of doing more community-based wellbeing and healthcare work. And part of my role in Air Sun project has been to support in the creation, analysis, and then interpretation of a community wellbeing survey. And if you wanted to know more about that, if you haven't watched it already, CEUT have a YouTube channel, and there are playlists of the findings of the Air Sun project, and they've been broken up into little bite-sized sections that you can have a listen to and watch in your own time. And one of the bits that Sharon pointed out, or one of the findings, as part of the Air Sun Wellbeing Survey, was in relation to questions about the environment and concerns about the environment. So we asked in the survey about how important the land and sea were in people's lives, and 92% of respondents stated it was important to very important to their lives. And we also invited people or respondents to comment further if they wanted in some free text boxes, and one of them was about if they wanted to document any feelings or concerns they had about the environment. And you can see here very much what Uistinn had mentioned earlier, and what Maria has talked about is the concerns about coastal erosion. Were coming up in a lot of the responses, concerns about the fragility of the local environment, the concerns of loss of habitats and loss of macar. And you can see here a quote as well about the environmental issues being important, but also about crofting, so the idea of changes to livelihoods and ways of life as well were of a particular concern. So where does this sort of stand with other research into mental health and other physiological impacts of climate change? So this is some work that has been conducted. Oh, sorry, I've just flipped an extra slide here. Is increasing evidence. So this links in with increasing evidence of links of climate change to mental health and well-being. And this is a figure from some research conducted by a team at Imperial College London. And it's looking at the impact of climate change on mental health and emotional well-being, current evidence and implementation for policy and practice. And you can see here that essentially it's showing the continuum of the impacts of climate change on mental health outcomes. So at the top here, we've got climate change impacts. So you've got gradual changes from temperatures, sea level increases, acute extreme weather events, so floods, fires, which we're obviously experiencing now in Greece, and chronic extreme climate events, such as droughts that are obviously experienced a lot in sub-Saharan Africa as well. This then kind of links into some direct or indirect impacts to communities, and then obviously then feeds into impacts on mental health here. So you can see here the direct impacts include obviously loss and damage of homes and property, crop and livestock, forced migration, changes to livelihood, and some of the indirect consequences of climate change include witnessing changes to homelands, witnessing or learning about climate change and ecological impacts, and those implications on people's emotional well-being and mental health. And this research goes into further detail about some of the examples of some of the mental health and physiological impacts on climate from climate change. So these include stress reactions, increases of stress reactions to events, strained social relationships, mental health conditions, such as increased instances of anxiety, depression, and stress-related conditions, such as post-traumatic stress disorders, increased feelings of helplessness, fear, and grief, suicidal behaviour, alcohol and substance abuse. And there's also some emerging emotional responses to climate change or eco emotions, and these include ecological grief, eco-anxiety, and solastalgia, which I think I pronounced correctly, but I'll go into a bit more detail about the terminology. So you can see here on the table, I've just provided a bit more about the definitions of these different emotional responses to climate change. And in particular, I wanted to sort of highlight the climate grief, ecological grief, and look at a bit more of the solastalgia in a bit more detail, because I think there's a lot here that comes, I can see evidence or examples of from some of the responses we received in our survey. So with ecological grief, it's defined as grief felt in relation to the experience or anticipated ecological losses, including the loss of species, ecosystems, and meaningful landscapes due to an acute or chronic environmental change. And some of the evidence that these researchers have found of this are specifically for communities with strong ties to particular places and those witnessing environmental destruction. So they give examples of Indigenous and farming communities being particularly at risk of experiencing this emotional reaction to climate change. Solastalgia is it's a newer concept. It's a concept that comes from the Australian philosopher Glenn Albrecht. And it's described as homesickness we feel while still at home. It's very closely linked to nostalgia. And it's essentially the pain and longing we feel as we realise the world immediately around us is changing, with our love for what the world serving us, as a catalyst for action on its behalf. And it's essentially described as a lived experience of negatively perceived environmental change. So essentially seeing that taking place in your homeland. And it's been reported in youths in Indonesia, Inuit communities in Northern Canada, farmers in Australia, residents and communities in the Great Barrier Reef have experienced solitalgia, and elders in the Torres Strait as well. And I think in this one particular, there is this sense of place and identity loss as well, which I think is particularly relevant to what we're doing here in North Uist as well. So what's being done about the links? Sorry, it keeps flicking through. The links with climate change and mental health. So the World Health Organization have responded to the growing evidence of the climate change and links to deterioration in mental health and well-being. And they've published their own policy, and this was published in, well, just June last year, actually. And they set out 5 key recommendations on potential approaches to address the mental health implications of climate change, and essentially integrating mental health support policies within any policy that looked at addressing climate change. And these are the 5 recommendations, and they're based on case examples from across the world where these have been implemented. So I'm not going to go into them in detail, but obviously feel free if you wanted to have a look at those recommendations. The actual policy brief from the World Health Organization is about 16 pages long, so it's not too onerous to go through if you wanted to have a look at that in a bit more depth. So what can we do? So there's a lot of evidence that shows for addressing emotional well-being and mental health in the face of climate change is actually being involved and doing something actively to address it. So this increases individual and collective well-being through a greater sense of agency and control of the situation, increasing feelings of meaning and empowerment, and provides social support through connection with like-minded communities. It can have a dual impact on people's well-being, however. So some researchers have identified that there's a potential distress experience for people when confronting the sheer scale of the issue of climate change as well. So that's just obviously something to bear in mind, and obviously looking at a balance and more of a community and a shared collective approach when addressing climate change, and the importance essentially of community for these kind of things. And they have a lovely quote here that I'm just going to end my presentation on. To sustain their mental health, engagement, empowerment, strong communities and support networks that are honest and hold space for their feelings are vital. And I hope that's something that we can explore as well in our discussions this evening.
Thank you, Jess. That was very informative. And I think there's a lot of work that can be done with communities and heritage to mitigate impacts from climate change as well. I'll go to Kay Hall now, who's our last panelist. Hi, Kay. I'm not sure if you're
Hello, everyone. Just give me 1 second to turn my video on.
Yes, we can see you now.
Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for having me today. I'm the Education and Community Outreach Officer at the Barbados Museum and Historical Society. And I think for us, with regard to young people, that's the focus of our push, really, with regard to our education around climate change and climate action. A lot of it is physical hands-on stuff. So, example, last Friday, we watched the entire inner basin of Carlisle Bay, which was our original trading port city. It's a part of historic Bridgetown and its garrison. And what we asked our students to do was to think about the effect of climate change on the Bay in 5 years, in 10 years, in 50 years, especially as we're responding to rises in sea level, to the increased pressures of tourism, because it is a World Heritage Site. But what the feedback we've been getting is the ability to interact with these spaces and to see them for yourself and to be there and alive and thinking about it really makes our young people think about these impacts. And we've been encouraging them to blog, to share their stories. We've also been encouraging them to take part in activism with regard to climate change. So basically to take part in turtle conservation, to take part in the activities to reforest our areas. 1/6 of our island is Scotland clays, which are gradually washing into the sea because there's nothing to hold them. So we do stuff like the building of gabion weirs, which is basically like a sort of metal cages filled with rocks, but which are used to bolster the landscape to stop the hill from sliding, but also partnering with people who are interested in reforesting or replanting that land, such as the Cocoa Hills Forest Reserve. So it's just an ongoing process. We try very hard to get them to look at themselves as members of a small island developing state. They're going to be voting. They're going to be leading the country in another few years. And we think the best way to get them to be thinking in terms of what can I do best in my country is to start now when they're 16, 18, 20, 25, and really get them to see how what they do is a part of that process. So we've shown them how town planning has affected the way how the city has impacted the bay, the landscape, the area around it. We've told them, we've basically introduced them to the various legislations. We've looked at the importance of having a World Heritage designation. We've looked at what happens if you lose your World Heritage designation. We've talked about managing the property, both to maintain the designation, but of and for itself and for our people. And these are all things that our young people are considering. And then we ask them and we encourage them to express this in the ways that best suit them. So we're getting digital activities which work towards that. We get everything from little skits, little plays, artwork, different types of things which encourage those young people to actively think about the world that they want to live in the future and how they can help shape it. Thank you.
Thank you, Kay. I think you answered one of my questions, which was going to be exactly about how we can get young people to be involved about the climate change issues. I don't know if anyone from the audience would like to ask any questions to our panelists or leave any comments. I think until someone asks a question, I'll just start by asking a general question. How can the community adapt to the effects of climate change, especially in terms of heritage preservation? How can we perhaps keep heritage, preserve the heritage so we don't lose it?
If I can start, we've been encouraging our young people to be personal activists. In Barbados, we have town hall meetings whenever there's any kind of planning activity involved in and around reworking our environment. So for example, if they're going to put in a marina, if they're going to erect a building or whatever, especially if it's in a listed heritage site, people are invited to come to what we call a town hall meeting, where they can tell everyone what their thoughts are on it, what they would like to see, what they would not like to see. Is where they can register their objections. And we encourage young people to attend to those areas and to actually go and have their voices heard. And they have been doing that. They've actually made me very, very proud. They make very good points. They are thoughtful about the long-term effects. And part of that is, yes, we've been educating them, but part of that is that they themselves are very concerned about the world that they and their children are going to live in. And our government is to a certain extent responsive as well to social media criticism. So we basically say that if you feel strongly enough about something, you can be the cause, you can be the movement, you can make that participating effort. And we are seeing that very much as a part of what our young people are doing.
That's really excellent work. And I think it gives a lot of power to youths. And I think it's something we're trying to do as well in North Uist, where we're giving the power to the community to feel like they can have a say and they can have an impact as well. I see John has his hand up, so I'll go to you, John, now.
Thank you, Sharon, and thank you to all the panel for their different perspectives on this on the complicated issue. Can I ask Kay from Barbados a question? Barbados is a big tourist destination for people from Europe and the UK, as you know much better than I do. Do you think that have efforts been made, or enough efforts been made to involve many tourists who visit Barbados to try and get an understanding both of the effects of climate change on the island and the importance of the heritage of Barbados, and how they can contribute, financially, or an increasing understanding of on both these issues? Thank you.
Hi. I would say that's kind of a mixed bag. Lots of us do continuing education, and we do invite the tourists as well as the local persons to be a part of that. Although we are targeting quite a few of our efforts towards the youth, they are in fact open most of the time to people, anyone who wants to participate. And it's impossible when living on a tourist destination to exclude, so they are invited, they are welcome to join. Not outside of what the museum itself does. For example, we have something called the Barbados Sea Turtle Project, which patrols the beaches during the laying season and the hatchling seasons every year to help, keep the turtles alive, because, with continuing building on the beach and so on, the extra lights and so on, you don't want them to find their way onto a highway or a ditch or something and lose their lives. But also, we also don't want the eggs or the hatchlings to go amiss because they're only now coming back from being an endangered species. And for example, tourists are invited to join on these walks. They assist with the patrols every year, and they do make donations to the cause, and they are encouraged to do so. With regard to us at the museum and our programming, we of course always invite people along. We share what we're doing. And we never, ever turn down a donation, which helps us to continue with our public awareness and our public education.
Thank you very much, Kay. That's it sounds as if you're doing a very great deal on a lot of fronts in Barbados. It's lovely to hear that.
Yes, thank you, Kay. It was very interesting to hear that, because in Malta we also have a lot of programs to safeguard turtle hatchling sites, but interestingly, it's always been done from like a nature minister kind of perspective, rather from a heritage perspective and from a historical society. So it's really good to see that historical societies are also getting involved in such climate action. We have another question from Bridget Bedley. Hi, Bridget.
Oh, hi, everybody. Thank you so much. I just heard about this event today, and I'm really pleased I found it. I'm an anthropologist at the University of St Andrews as well, working on mental health and climate change. I've done a little bit of research in the UK about it, but still quite a new field for me. So it's great to meet you all, and I will kind of reach out and connect, hopefully, for the future. But Maria, I was wondering, I'm really interested in what you're doing with VR, and I think it's a really creative way to, visualize this. I'm wondering, how do you, when you design these videos, how do you strike the balance between not making them too scary, and particularly with young people? What I've found talking to people is that, striking this balance with how we talk to children, especially about the seriousness of this, without making them distressed or prone to anxiety and depression, but also trying to educate and raise awareness. So that's one question for you. And then for anybody else, I agree that the focus on young people and talking to young people is so important, particularly when we think about mental health impacts. But in some of our interviews, we found that older people are also really struggling with mental health. I heard stories of kind of suicidal ideation from older people too. And I think that because so much of the focus is on young people's health and well-being at the moment, particularly the media, the older generations are getting lost in that story too, and are often positioned as the people who have caused all the problems. But there are so many activists who have been doing this for decades and are so involved, and I feel like their stories are also getting lost. So how much of all of the work that you're doing, and not just in Scotland, but for Kay as well in Barbados, you know, how much is that, how valuable is that intergenerational view, and so that we're not pushing this kind of us and them, young versus older people narrative, which I see a lot of. But thank you everybody for all the work you're doing. It's really inspiring. I'm happy to be here.
Thank you so much for the question. I think that's a really good question, Bridget, and it's something that I'm continuously developing from my research. So one side of it is the main objective of my research is kind of to help people accept the reality of climate change. So that's a big issue that people are facing in general in education. And because it's such an abstract concept that relates to future situations, to situations that are distant from us, as well as spatially and temporally, that's why I brought VR into it, in order to make the information much more concrete. And of course, that means that there's the risk of creating eco-anxiety, I guess, when you show these future scenarios that are negative. But through my own research, I discovered that as long as you pair that with a big emphasis on solutions and on what people can do and how they can get involved, then you can achieve the desired result. I'm still quite early on evaluating the impact of these kinds of visualizations, but that's kind of a thing that guides me to make sure I also put an emphasis on the solutions. And basically that's my strategy. But I'm still learning a lot about how to strike that balance. And I think it's a really good point.
Thank you, Maria. I don't know if there's anyone.
In our case,
Okay.
I'm not sure if you can hear me. I may have to turn my video back off because I'm having a little bit of tech problems. But basically, in our case, it's been a slightly interesting thing. Our older generation was not necessarily what you would call environmentally conscious. So it is generally a case where we're sending the young people back home to educate their parents and their grandparents about how they are, in fact, sometimes contributing to the issues we're facing. So, for example, deforestation is I don't want to say a cultural thing in Barbados, but I've grown up with people cutting trees down simply because they were inconvenient. The government has legislated against it, but it's been kind of an uphill battle with generations older than me and maybe a little bit above. For reference, I'm 50. So the young people I'm teaching are like my daughter's age and a little younger, but people in my mother's age, and my mom is about 20 or so years older than I am, they basically see vegetation as a nuisance, as you've got to clear up leaves. So they have a tendency to cut trees down and cement things. And that's something that we're gradually having to do public education, public awareness, telling people, you know, if you cut all of the trees down, there's going to be flooding, there's going to be problems. It's going to affect the things that you fish for in the sea. It's going to decrease that because it's going to kill off the leaf. The fish are going to go away. And it's taken many, many years to start to sensitize that generation. So it's not so much that there's a divide as there is a fact that they've got to go home and tell their parents that if you fish and you take sea urchins out of the sea all year round, then there will be no sea urchins left in the Barbados because you've eaten them all. That's a delicacy in Barbados that I have not seen being served on a table since I was a child. And in a way, the pandemic kind of assisted with that because our national bird is the pelican, and we destroyed their natural nesting place when we built our deep water harbor. We literally built a bridge out to the island and reclaimed the land. And pelicans started being seen in Barbados again during the pandemic, but I hadn't seen one alive since I was a child prior to that. And there are a number of other species that have suddenly started being seen when they have started to become quite rare. I mean, on the other hand, we've now got a monkey population that's like completely out of hand and may run us off the island yet. But basically, a lot of these species declining has been because older generations have not really been culturally, ecologically sensitive, so to speak, with regard to what needed to be preserved, what needed to be protected. And now we're seeing their children going home to educate them about safeguarding our environment and our island.
Thank you very much for that, Kayla. That was really interesting, because I've definitely seen parallels as well, even with my own family, where sometimes I have to explain perhaps the research behind something and behind the effects of climate change and the reality of it. I'll go to Ali Watson now, because she's had her hand up for a while. Hi.
Hi, hi everyone, and thanks everybody on the panel for all your good work and everything that you're saying today. I'm going to keep the St Andrews connection. I run the Third Generation project at the University of St Andrews, and we basically focus on climate change, climate justice advocacy. And I had a question for Jess in particular, because it just seems to me that there's so much of a link between solastalgia, if I'm pronouncing it right, and climate justice, you know, and the communities that are particularly impacted by solastalgia are also those that are particularly impacted, you know, in terms of climate justice. So I just wondered if that was sort of a framing that was going to be coming into your work, or, you know, or whether that climate change framing is really just where the work's sitting at the moment.
It's really just where the work's sitting at the moment, but it is interesting when the solastalgia, or that frame or concept was developed. It was looking at communities in New South Wales in Australia, and in particular it was in relation to, well, there was climate change events, but equally a mine being built, and that had a lot of implications on people's mental health when that happened as well. And so there is that element of, as you say, climate justice there, I think, there definitely. I can easily share the reference there for you as well, Ali, if you wanted, for that work, if you wanted to explore that a bit more.
Good, thank you.
No problem. And I was just going to pop on there, Sharon, as well, just with what Maria was saying, and I think what Bridget was talking about, that balance, and I think that's something that I touched on in my presentation as well, is the being aware of climate change, but equally the idea of too much information. It can lead obviously to eco-anxiety, and obviously can have a detrimental impact as well, and just really about that balance. And also I think just touching a little bit on with what Maria was saying about people that don't want to see it, and often actually denial is a defense mechanism as well itself. So there are people that are maybe genuine, don't want to believe it, but equally denial in itself sometimes can be a defense mechanism that people use when something just seems so overwhelming as well. And I suppose it's finding ways of trying to bridge that and open that up.
Thanks, Jess. I don't know if you had a question as well. No, okay, that's clear then. Bridget?
Sorry. Yeah, just in response to that, I'm designing a project at the moment with some colleagues across different countries and disciplines, but one of the ways that we're thinking of approaching this is almost to not have the language of climate change in the forefront of the project, but instead to talk about how, you know, social and environmental places are changing, and then from there, because I think it's also, the project I did before was very much like climate anxiety, climate activism in the title, and then it was just white middle class people that participated, right, who were already very active in that. So you miss out so many people when you use these things, and I think that point is absolutely spot on. Is yeah, how do we engage people that are either in denial or just not interested or too afraid or underrepresented groups? So that's a good point.
Yes, I think sometimes if we're too negative about the situation, that might not help a lot. People might get more in denial. And sometimes if you're thinking about the future, seeing the positive outcomes of what can happen if we do make changes can have a better effect on people. With respect to heritage, I have a question where I wanted to see what people thought about the use of heritage to mitigate these mental issues and psychological issues that Jess mentioned earlier. So for instance, in the Öresund project, we have these well-being walks, which are there to increase well-being, but also in a way they highlight some climate change issues. What other heritage benefits can we use in the climate change question? It's a general question to everyone.
Could I kick it off maybe with a thought? I was just thinking when I was researching why people are struggling to accept the reality of climate change. A lot of it is not only related to it being distant from us in space and time, but also that people remove themselves from the impact of climate change, so they have a hard time internalizing that it could happen to them. So I think if you put heritage at the forefront of some initiatives, heritage is such a huge part of people's identity in terms of languages or spaces, that I feel like maybe it would breach the connection between the self and the impact of climate change. Like you'd feel more engaged with it, and it would help you kind of be more empowered to do something about it if you feel like you're also being part of the conversation and you're impacted from it. So that's kind of my thought when it comes to heritage.
I think also oh, sorry, Simon's got his hand up.
Hi, yeah, I was just going to say one of the important things for Uist is loss of our heritage in coastal areas. Not only do we have rising sea level, we also have a landmass which is slowly sinking, which is exacerbating the whole problem. And I think it's really important that the coastal heritage that we have, we can't stop it happening. It is being eroded, it is being lost, but it should be recorded. And I know that the SCAPE project, which is based out of St Andrews, is doing a lot towards that. But it's down to local people as well to draw attention to anything that they feel is being lost around our coastlines, and it should be recorded.
Thank you, Simon. I think this also ties very well with what we talked about in our last webinar and about issues of place and identity. And I think Alan was going to say something about that and in response to what Maria was saying as well.
Yeah, sorry, I can't figure out how to put my hand up, which is a bit embarrassing. It was just a discussion about, you know, why sometimes people don't take it as seriously as it should be taken, and why there hasn't been as much progress as there should be. And I'm sure that you're right in terms of the sort of psychological, you know, do you scare people or do you give people confidence and these sort of things? But you know, and people not wanting to believe it and all that. But you know, I think at the end of the day, the reason, the main reason, is because it's a malicious one. Is that there are people who are deliberately setting out to muddy the waters, to cause confusion, and to deny the fact that climate change is taking place. I mean, you know, the most famous of those is you know, was recently president of the United States, and these people do it for vested interest. You know, the vested interests of oil and coal. You know, and actually, in some ways, climate change is good for them. You know, the melting of ice in the Arctic is opening up new reserves that can be mined and so on. And so there's millions of dollars to be made as a result of that. So I think that's, you know, it's important to bear in mind. And from the perspective of heritage, I think that there is so much that heritage can help with over the whole thing. But I think the main thing is that you know, the heritage industry is also a network of education institutions which reaches out to the public on a day-to-day basis, and it's the only sort of national or international set of organizations we have that are dedicated to lifelong learning. And so if we have hope that people will reach an understanding of the threat of climate change, and societies will do something to mitigate and address and to stop it from happening, then I think heritage museums and other organizations are kind of the key to that being achieved, you know. And looking at if we look at the past and we look at the present, one thing is that we can know is that, you know, what happens in the future isn't predetermined. There are a range of different futures, and I think that what computers can do is to help people imagine and understand what that range of futures is, and how what can be done to make sure that we have the future we want, rather than the one that seems to be arriving at us in a rather fast rate of knots.
Thank you, Alan. If anyone has anything to add to that, please raise your hands. I see John also has his hand up.
Thanks, Sharon. I think what Alan said is actually quite important, and that there's now quite a concerted agenda to try and rubbish the evidence on climate change, which would be to the detriment not just of us, but of our children and grandchildren. And it's been very interesting, the political responses to the recent by-elections in the UK, when both the main political parties have been trying quite hard to backtrack on commitments to efforts to address climate change. And these forces are remarkably powerful, in fact. If you look on a social media like Twitter, you'll see that people have quite a lot of influence over the general public. People like Andrew Neil, Alison Pearson, and Neil Oliver, who recently did the series on Coast, and intriguingly, are now kind of full-on climate change deniers. And it's important. It's really quite difficult to overestimate the effect, the deleterious effect that these have on the fully worked out science, which tells us that climate change is real and will affect our future, and is affecting our future, as we've seen in Europe and China and the United States and Algeria in the last week or so. I know that's going quite a long way from a common equity Uist, but I think it's important to recognise that these are influencers which really are not working in the best interests of ourselves, our children, our grandchildren, and indeed future generations, as well as causing species extinction and so on. So I think we need to think politically as well as scientifically. I think that's I'm a member of something called the UK Health Professionals Alliance Against Climate Change, which is now involves nearly all the professional organisations involving health professionals in the UK, and is chaired by Richard Smith. And they're quite a powerful voice against these forces, and promoting what we can do as individual doctors, physios, nurses, and so on, to address this, as well as using our powers of advocacy for our elected representatives as well. So that's a bit of a rant, but I think it's quite an important point, and I think it reinforces what Alan has said. We really need to be very, very skeptical about some of the things that we hear on media. Thank you.
Thank you, John. And yeah, I would tend to agree with that. I think one way of making our voice heard stronger than all the false information is perhaps by in fact tying it to real life experiences such as through heritage and identity. I don't know if anyone else has any other questions. We maybe have time for one more question. If not, I also have a question. So my question was related to peatlands because Sujan mentioned peatlands in the beginning. And I was wondering what could be done on North Uist to explain perhaps that, you know, burning peatlands and sometimes the cutting of peatlands and destroying of peatlands can in fact give off a lot of CO2 in the environment. So is there anything that the community or heritage societies can do to explain the importance of keeping peatlands or restoring them?
Right.
Yeah, go ahead, Alan.
I mean, yeah, the issue of peat, I think, is a critical one because it does involve so much carbon dioxide and it's so important as a peat sink. But I do think that the sort of you know, the sort of population of in North Uist cutting peat and burning it in a sustainable manner probably isn't that much of a problem. I think that the major problem had been previously the sort of way in which peat had been sort of used on an industrial scale to change the composition of gardens and to you know, be used in sort of gardening and farming scenarios. And then secondly, I think, and I'm not, it's just my opinion, but it is that the health of the peatlands. So in terms of not letting them dry out, having them properly watered and irrigated and all of that sort of thing, so that they do maintain themselves as a proper environment and don't dry out and aren't destroyed, I think is really important. And so projects that look at the sort of restoration of peatlands, I know we're involved in this project called DACHI, Digital Action on Climate Change and Heritage Environments, with partners in different places. And part of that is in the Faroe Islands, a project which is looking at regenerating the health of peatland in the Faroes. And so I think that sort of thing can be really positive and isn't incompatible with sustained usage of peat in local communities.
Yeah, I think using it sustainably would be the way to go and regenerate. I don't know if there are any regeneration programs in North Uist or if there's a need for them over there in North Uist, but sustainable use is definitely important. If no one else has any other questions or comments, I will just ask one last question to each of the panel members. So we've talked about what historical societies can do. We've talked also about the harmful things that popular media perhaps might have on the climate change issue. What is one action that each of us can do to help mitigate the climate change? I'll start off with Maria.
Thank you. I think that's a great question. There's plenty of things that come to my mind. First of all, I think up to each person's ability, it's probably the best to support organizations that are already doing a lot of initiatives, because as it's been mentioned as well, especially in the chat, the real solution lies with government and corporation. So when we support climate organizations, it can go much further in impacting governmental change, in my opinion. Then I think personal choices are also very valuable. Perhaps eating less animal products, or maybe when we go outside on a walk, perhaps picking up 3 pieces of trash. This is something new that I've been trying to implement myself. Like when I go for a walk, at least pick up 1 piece of trash or something that's on the ground, just to try and make the environment better. I think that those are the things that come to mind.
Yes, thank you. And actually that touches upon you know, the use of plastic and the amount of plastic that's in the oceans that we haven't really talked about today, but it's a really big problem. I'll go to Uzcan now to answer this question so that he's not neither first nor last this time.
Yeah. And I had my hand up several times. Clearly you weren't seeing it.
Oh, yeah.
Coming in from a,
Really sorry,
a different side. Anyway, in picking up trash, I pick up trash almost daily on my walks on the Hebridean Way. And it's usually either plastic empty Coke or water, you know, which I take home to my own bin, and that's tourists again. But you know, when we talk about heritage, you must remember that a lot of heritage organizations are volunteers, and life is made quite difficult for them by government, or specifically by government agency, in the work they make them do. And I refer specifically to accreditation at the moment, which we are going through, and it's a huge piece of work for volunteers to do. And I think they need to look at that kind of thing to make it easier for heritage organizations to remain, because quite a number of them are giving up because of these rules and regulations. And today, I think we've seen in the press the huge reduction in potential museum services in Glasgow. You know, so the funding is really quite critical, and the support of government and its agencies is important to make sure heritage organizations carry on functioning in their own areas, because the way things are managed currently makes life very, very difficult for them. And I know 2 or 3 people from our organization, I don't do this piece of work, but there are others who spend hours and hours and get quite stressed out doing it. So I had wanted to say something about video as well, if I can, Sharon, because yes. I mentioned before the Balashar Causeway issue, where rising sea levels sees overtopping and cut off several times over the winter, and it's something that's increasing. But the first thing that happens now is a video of overtopping appears on social media, which then gets sent to me, which puts pressure on me to try and do something about it. And I use the same thing to pressurize Scottish government and UK government to provide the funding to do something about it, without success at the moment, because they'll always say, oh, well, it only happens 10 times in the winter, and it only affects so many people, you know, it's not really a priority. It's, you know, but it's quite stressful for the people who might need an ambulance, or the emergency service worker who lives there. So I'd be interested in having a further discussion about it with the young lady who talked about it earlier at some point. Thank you. Rant over.
Thank you, Uzcan. Yes, I think, well, firstly, money is an issue in this case, and you know, any donation is always welcome for historical societies to continue their work, especially when they are having to do so much more to try and mitigate issues that aren't even really directly related to them. I'll go to Jess now.
It's a really difficult one to answer, Sharon. I think sometimes when you're asked about what you do for the climate, there's often a conception that you're virtue signaling, or you know, people will say, oh, you're trying to make me feel bad because I don't do that, or I don't do this. I think understanding everyone's way of life as well, because obviously before I moved up to the islands, I had a different view of environmentally friendly and recycling and that, and it wasn't until I moved up to the Outer Hebrides when you looked at infrastructure there, and sometimes some of the things that we are able to do in urban environments with recycling isn't always as easy to do up on the islands. So I think there's that kind of thing of just connecting with others, speaking to each other, and I think that's always a good thing, I think, when we're dealing with issues like climate change and seeing things from different perspectives, and hopefully we can find a way forward.
Thank you, Jess. And I'll finish up with Kay.
Anne,
So,
could you connect with that?
I would say, actually, well, I will tell you what I do. It seems like a little thing, but I think eventually I will see a big impact. Each time I face a room full of young people and I'm teaching them and I'm telling them all the different things I would like them to learn about climate change, I also ask them to tell me what they think, what they would like to see. And then I say to them, that is what I want you to keep at the forefront of your mind as you get older, as you move into the workforce, as you become a part of the community, a constructive part of the community, because you're young today, but 10 years from now, you'll be working, you'll be voting, you will have a political voice. You have a political voice now, but you'll be able to vote in another few years. And as you get older and as you move up in the society, you're going to move into positions where the decisions you make can impact your country. And I want you to always be mindful of what you learn here in this moment. And I've had students come back and say, I haven't got to the top yet, but I have actually been in a position where I was able to say yes or no, and I voted for the environment. So it seems like a little bit, but I think the younger that we get to students and we get them with that part of conscious, you get lower numbers of climate deniers, you get more conscious citizens, they spread the information to their friends. They've in fact been bringing their friends to our program and saying, you know, I couldn't explain exactly, but I brought my friend and now you have to tell them what you told me. But the idea is that sort of domino effect where, you know, we are adding and aggregating to these people who are one day going to be the persons, because we right now, the climate deniers, now they're making the decisions now, but they will not be making the decisions forever. And likewise, these young people are themselves influencing the world around them in their own digital spaces. I tell them all the time, I want to see what you're posting when you post something that you know I'd like to see. So I follow them, I encourage them, I encourage them to post, I encourage them to be active. And I've seen that digital map of individuals spread as I see my young people go into the world and start to make something of themselves. And that heartens me, you know, for generations to come, not just for climate change, other things too. For example, they are more willing to discuss those contentious and difficult histories in safe spaces that they create amongst themselves. And that makes me absolutely so happy. But also for our world, for our planet, I think that little bit, that aggregate, that continuing movement for them to share and spread and bring themselves along with them, that I think is something that we each need to work. But every time you come into contact with somebody, you tell them it's your responsibility, but also you have that power.
Thank you, Kay. I think activism is the one thing that we can really do the most of to try and get our voice heard. And as Ujan was saying, you know, sometimes things might seem a bit too local perhaps, or, you know, it doesn't happen to a lot of people. So people who are in power don't really hear what other people have to say. But with activism, hopefully we can make our voice heard. So that was our discussion for today. Thank you very much. I posted the link for CEUT's Facebook. Please follow it. We have a lot of events at the moment. They're running the summer festival. So there's weekly walks as well as other places at the school, other events at the school, sorry. In August, we will also have the digital phase. That's on the 11th and 12th of August, happening also at Carinish School. And that will continue the discussion about climate change. There will be Maria who will be showcasing the virtual experience that she's talked about today. So if anyone is able to make it to North Uist, please do. Thank you very much and follow our channels.